5 of the monumental Buddhist sites that are in Bamiyan in Afghanistan is a site that was much in the news in the months of 2001 prior to 9/11. We're going to talk about why in a minute. But before we do that, I think that it's really helpful just to take a quick look at 5 of the monumental Buddhist sites that are in the 250 and to discuss just briefly some of the commonalities that these 5 sites share. So the first of these, certainly the oldest and therefore most influential, is the Great Stupa at Sanchi in India. And as Buddhism spreads out from India into going north and east and southeast, we will see it moving to Indonesia, where we will see the Borobudur Temple. In addition to that, it goes to the north and northwest, where we have Bamiyan. In addition to that, it's going to go up into China, and we'll study the Longmen Caves in China. And finally, it will make its way over to Japan, represented in our image set by Todaiji. So what are some commonalities that these sites share that will help us to get a handle on what are very complex structures? The first thing that I'd like for us to remember is that all of these sites are associated with monasteries. Now, I want us to remember that Shakyamuni, Siddhartha, the historical Buddha, established the first community of monks. So monasticism has always been part of the Buddhist tradition. And so all of these sites had huge numbers of monks who lived and worked and around these sites. And so they would have been very busy and crowded with monastic activity. The second thing is that they were all pilgrimage destinations. Most of them, I haven't been able to confirm this for all of them, but most of them were found on trade routes. And let's remember that trade is not just about trading goods, it's also about trading ideas and beliefs and technology. And so we've got a huge amount of cultural exchange that is going to happen, and the spread of Buddhism is going to go along these trade routes. And so the merchants, the pilgrims along the trade routes are going to hear about these sites and come visit these sites. All of these sites, the next thing I want us to remember is that all of these structures were built to enable the main Buddhist ritual of circumambulation. Now, it's critical for us to remember that they all have ritual pathways going clockwise, just like in Hinduism, so that the pilgrims can circumambulate. And what I want us to remember is that, therefore, the function of these sites is intended to help the pilgrim move closer on their own path to enlightenment. Symbolically, the physical path that they take in circumambulation symbolizes the spiritual path that they take toward enlightenment. Another commonality, and this is meant to enable, to help with that move toward enlightenment, another commonality is the fact that there is sculpture at all of these sites. Now, the sculpture will appear in 2 different forms. On the one hand, we've got 3D sculptures of the Buddha, such as the ones that we see right here, either standing or sitting. Often he will be meditating. If not meditating, sometimes he is shown teaching. Or the other form that we see is bas-relief. And the relief sculpture that we see at all of these sites shows stories from the life of the actual Buddha, Shakyamuni, or also known as Siddhartha, or of his 500 earlier lives. And so the purpose of these bas-relief sculptures is to enable the pilgrim to meditate on the actions of the Buddha that will help to lead them toward enlightenment. So as they're circumambulating, they're looking at these images and they're thinking about the Buddha's acts of compassion, which is therefore meant to aid them toward their own enlightenment. Another commonality is that when we don't have this at all of these sites, but when we have these great big Buddhas, scholars believe that these are intended to represent the form of the Buddha that is called the Vairochana Buddha. You'll also hear it pronounced the Vairocana Buddha. And the Vairochana Buddha is the supreme Buddha from whom all of the other Buddhas emanate. It might be helpful for us to think of him as boss Buddha, as like the head honcho Buddha, the supreme Buddha, like a king with power over all of those beneath him. Now, why would the people who commissioned these big sites, such as Longmen Caves or Todaiji, why would they want this particular form of the Buddha to be used? Well, this makes some kind of sense. If we can remember that, in the same way that Vairochana Buddha is supreme over all of the other forms of the Buddha, a king is supreme over all of his subjects. So one more time, the Great Stupa at Sanchi in India, the earliest and oldest oldest, the most influential, that establishes the basic iconography and circumambulatory path. Borobudur in Indonesia, which is considered by many the largest Buddhist site in the world. Bamiyan in Afghanistan, which we're going to associate with the active destruction by the Taliban in 2001. Longmen Caves, a phenomenal complex that stretches on two sides of a river for about a mile. And then finally, Todaiji in Nara, which is still the largest wooden structure anywhere in the world. So with this introduction, let's go back, and I want us to think about the emergence of Buddhism in India. So as we said, the Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, was the one who established monasticism, who organized the first community of monks. So very, very early in Buddhism, we have the beginnings of what we call Buddhist cave architecture, where communities of monks would gather in these areas, often along rivers, where there are soft stone cliffs, such as limestone and sandstone, and they carved into the cliff, sometimes hundreds of caves. And they lived in these caves. They painted the walls of these caves. And so this becomes one of the most important early forms of Buddhist architecture. So Buddhist cave architecture is going to spread outward. It's going to spread up to Bamiyan, and it's also going to spread over to China. But if we look back here at the image that we had up just a moment ago, this area is one of the earliest of the Buddhist cave monuments, and it is called the Ajanta Caves, and it's not too far from Mumbai in India. And we can see some of the amazing sculptures and paintings with which the interior of the cave system is ornamented. So when we think about where we're going, here is the original site of Sanchi, and then the Ajanta Caves are farther down here toward Mumbai. But what we're going to be looking at right now is we're going to go up into Afghanistan. Now, there's a very important trade route that goes up from the Indian subcontinent on this side of the Himalayas, and then this trade route connects with Central Asia. So there was a tremendous amount of traffic along that trade route. This also branched off to connect with the Silk Road. And so for more than 1,000 years, Bamiyan Valley, as it is called, was this lush valley that was a hub of commercial activity, and because it was a hub of commercial activity, it was therefore also a hub of cultural, religious, artistic, and intellectual exchange. Now, Buddhism came here from India by the 2nd century BCE. Monasteries and sanctuaries were built over a several hundred-year period. This is about an 8/10 of a mile section of cliff between about 400 and 800 of the Common Era. This section of the cliff is carved with about 1,000 caves painted with Buddhist scenes, and we'll take a look at some of those in just a minute. There were also relief carvings and sculptures in the round. During the 6th century, however, 2 massive Buddhas were carved into the cliff face. One at the east end, and this one was about 120 feet tall, so think a 12-story building. And then the one at the west end of the cliff was 175 feet tall, almost an 18-story building high. These were among the largest Buddhas ever created. Now, I want us to take a look at what these would have looked like. We're looking at early photographs of the Western Buddha, the larger of the 2 Buddhas. And we can see that these are in very high relief, that they carve the negative space around the form of the Buddha that is basically made of solid stone. And then they used rods that they drove into the stone as a way of helping to support a layer of plaster that they put on top of the stone. And then they painted that in really, really bold and often bright colors. And we're going to see some examples of what those might have looked like in just a minute. Now, it's interesting that the style of the Buddhas that we see here does itself reflect that international cultural exchange that had by this point already been going on for centuries, because the style in which these massive Buddhas were carved is what we call the Gandharan style. Now, the Gandharan style began way back in the 4th century BCE when Alexander the Great came in and conquered northern India and this area right here. He established cities in which he left Greek citizens who then mixed with the locals, and they brought in that Greek Hellenistic art style, which was then applied to Buddhist content. And so when we look at the Gandharan style, we can see the more naturalistic depiction of the flowing drapery and the curls of the hair than we see in the Gupta style or other more traditional Indian styles. And so we see that reflected in the folds of the fabric that we have right here, and descriptions of the hair on the Buddha before while it was still there. It described these wavy locks on the head of the Buddha. Now, another thing that I want us to remember is that there were circumambulation, as with all of those sites, was part of the practice, both of the monks in their meditation and of the pilgrims who came to visit the site. And so the way that these massive Buddhas were carved was there was a circumambulatory path around the feet of the Buddha, and then it would have been possible to go all the way up to the level of the head of the Buddha as well. And so we can see that there were side chapels that went off behind the head of the Buddha. Here is a side chapel over here that we can see the opening to right here. We can kind of make out where this one connected over here. And so circumambulation would have involved, again, looking at paintings that reflect the stories from the life of the Buddha. Bamiyan Valley continued to sustain these communities of Buddhist monks until the late 9th century. And it's at about that point when Muslim rulers imposed Islam on the area. And so that leads us to a discussion of why do the faces of the Buddha look like this in the photographs that we have from before the time that they were destroyed? There are a couple of different suggestions about this. Some scholars believe that this was actually a ledge for the upper part of the face that was made from wood and then painted. But other scholars believe that the face would originally have been carved from stone, but that then during the Mughal rule that they came in intentionally and cut away the other upper part of the face as a way of avoiding idolatry. In any case, what is ultimately going to happen is that as Islam becomes firmly entrenched in this area, a very fundamentalist sect of Islam called the Taliban gained control over Afghanistan in the 1990s and early 2000s. And as for a couple of reasons, the Taliban made the decision to destroy the two huge Buddhas. And so as plans for this destruction were made and news of this went all around the world, people from the West put up this hue and cry and started spending money to try to preserve and preserve the Buddhas and prevent this destruction. This angered the Taliban even more, who believed that money should be being spent on humanitarian aid instead of in trying to help a sculpture. And so between their desire to carry out iconoclasm and their very open rebellion against Western economic and cultural domination in the area, they actually destroyed the Buddhas by using explosives and mines and all kinds of things, such that all that is left today is the negative space in which the Buddhas once stood. Knowing that the destruction of the Buddhas was going to attract international attention, what the Taliban did was actually invite foreign journalists and photographers to come to Bamiyan and record and to report on this event as a way of spreading their point of view to the rest of the world. There's ongoing discussion as to what should be done with the site of Bamiyan and the remnants of the Buddhas that were there, but clearly we will never be able to see it in the way in which the pilgrims did for hundreds and hundreds of years.